Good morning. I'm very happy to be here to talk with you about some current regulatory and economic challenges facing antibiotic R&D in the United States, and specifically two current proposals that the IDSA has put forward to try to address these issues. First, I'll give you a brief bit of background about IDSA. As you can see, we represent over 10,000 infectious diseases physicians and scientists across the United States, and our membership has a very broad array of primary professional activities, but most of our members do provide direct patient care. And increasingly, they are seeing more and more patients that have very serious or life-threatening infections that cannot be effectively treated with our current arsenal of antibiotics. We face a number of challenges in this issue in the United States. One of the first being that, unlike many other disease areas, there's really no easily identifiable patient advocacy group to help us push for change and to really put a human face on the problem of antibiotic resistance. So largely because of that, IDSA decided that we had to step in and help advocate on behalf of our patients. I'll give you a brief bit of history about IDSA's involvement in this issue. In 2004, we released our Bad Bugs, No Drugs report, which was really geared toward U.S. policymakers to help begin laying the groundwork to educate people about this problem and why we felt there was a great need for government action. Since then, as you can see, we've issued many more reports to continue trying to further this work. In 2010, we launched the 10 by 20 initiative, a global commitment to try to develop 10 new antibiotics by the year 2020. The following year, in 2011, in accordance with World Health Day, we issued the Combating Antimicrobial Resistance Report, which laid out specific policy recommendations, again, largely geared toward the U.S. to help address the problem of resistance and the dry antibiotic pipeline. We've also periodically put forward updates on the antibiotic pipeline, the progress that is or is not being made. Most recently, in April of this year, we put out a report on the pipeline, which again found that progress in this area, particularly around new drugs to treat the gram-negative bacteria, is unfortunately still quite elusive. So the challenges to antibiotic R&D are a long list and quite varied, as you all know. I'll be talking largely today about some of the problems associated with regulatory hurdles to particularly doing traditional large-scale clinical trials for antibiotics, particularly those antibiotics to treat the very serious or life-threatening infections where there's an unmet medical need. For a variety of reasons, as you know, it's very hard often to identify enough patients to populate a traditional large-scale trial. In addition to the proposal that I'll talk about today, IDSA also just this week launched a new set of recommendations toward the development of better and more rapid diagnostic tools, which is something else we think is really critical to help address these issues. Today I'll also talk about one of our newly proposed economic incentives to help further incentivize antibiotic R&D. So we believe strongly at IDSA that we need a new regulatory approach to help provide a feasible pathway for new drugs to help treat patients who have serious and life-threatening infections. IDSA has proposed the Limited Population Antibacterial Drug, or LPAD, pathway to help speed the approval of drugs for patients whose infections currently have few or no satisfactory treatment options. So LPAD would be a new, rapid, voluntary antibacterial drug approval pathway. I would note that it is only intended for products that would treat serious or life-threatening infections where there's an unmet medical need. So LPAD is not intended for products that would treat non-serious infections or infections that already have a satisfactory set of treatment options. And the real hallmark here of LPAD products is that they could be approved for a limited population based upon smaller and faster clinical trials. We think this will help address the hurdle of identifying sufficient numbers of patients to populate traditional large-scale clinical trials. We also believe that smaller trials may be less expensive and thus more attractive and more feasible for companies. So how would this work? First, I would note this would be voluntary upon drug sponsors. So the FDA could not force a company to pursue an LPAD approval instead of a traditional or broader approval. Instead, the sponsor would have to seek, and then FDA would approve the designation of an LPAD drug. So as I said, LPAD drugs could be approved based upon smaller and faster clinical trials, but it's very important to note that LPAD would not alter the standard of evidence. So a drug must still be demonstrated to be safe and effective for the limited indicated population. The benefits of the drug must be demonstrated to outweigh the risks, taking into account unmet medical need. LPAD drugs, as I said, are intended only for patients with serious or life-threatening infections that have few or no satisfactory treatment options. In these instances, like when we believe a patient is likely to die without an LPAD drug, we believe that a drug that carries a less precise estimate of risk because it was studied in a smaller trial may be appropriate. The LPAD designation, a description of the drug's indicated population, and a very special logo would all appear on the drug's label. We believe this labeling information and the logo would help signal to the healthcare community that LPAD drugs are special. They're different from traditional antibiotics, and they need to be used only for a limited population of patients that have serious or life-threatening infections. We recognize that it's very important to put in place safeguards to help drive the appropriate use of LPAD drugs. Given that these drugs will carry a less precise estimate of risk, we know they should not be used in patients that don't have very serious infections or patients who could be treated with traditional therapies. Further, by helping to limit the use of LPAD drugs, we will help protect them from the development of resistance. So we think that there needs to be a mechanism in place to help collect information about how this pathway and drugs approved under this pathway are being used. CDC's National Healthcare Safety Network is a mechanism that the CDC, congressional leaders who are working on LPAD legislation, and other stakeholders all believe would be an appropriate tool to do this. LPAD would also give FDA the ability to have pre-review of promotional materials to help ensure that LPAD drugs are being marketed appropriately. We believe that because LPAD drugs would be very clearly labeled as being very different from other antibiotics, that their mere existence and entry into the marketplace could help encourage healthcare facilities to develop and put into place antimicrobial stewardship programs, which would help guide the use not only of LPAD drugs, but all antimicrobial drugs. And IDSA is also working through several separate and additional advocacy initiatives to try to advance the implementation of stewardship programs at all healthcare facilities. I would note that despite all of these safeguards, ultimately, we believe very, very strongly that the clinical decision-making must remain in the hands of physicians. So for example, a physician may be seeing a patient that presents with a very serious life-threatening infection, but they may not be able to have a rapid enough diagnostic to know immediately what that infection is, or it may be something that differs slightly from an LPAD indication. But if this is a patient whose infection is going to be resistant to all of the other traditional antibiotics that a physician has to throw at them, we still want to make sure that that physician, has the tools necessary to treat that patient with the best of his or her clinical judgment. So again, nothing about any LPAD legislation would interfere in the practice of medicine, and ultimately clinical decision-making would remain in the hands of physicians. So I want to switch gears briefly and talk a little bit about economic incentives, because we know that even if we are successful in getting the LPAD pathway approved and addressing some of the other regulatory hurdles, we still believe we need greater economic incentives to help further antibiotic R&D. We had a very strong first step last year with some legislation enacted called the Generating Antibiotics Incentives Now, or the GAIN Act, that was included in the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, or FDASIA, as we call it for short, which provides additional exclusivity for qualifying antibiotic and antifungal drugs to treat serious and life-threatening infections. But IDSA has always maintained that we need a combination of push and pull incentives to really revitalize antibiotic R&D. And so we know GAIN was a wonderful first step, but more is needed. So IDSA is proposing an antibiotic and antifungal drug transferable research and development tax credit. This is a very new proposal and one that we've modeled after the basic structure of the orphan drug tax credit, which has been very successful at spurring R&D for very rare diseases. In short, this proposal would provide a credit of 50% of qualified clinical testing expenses, essentially phases 2 and 3, for the taxable year. And products eligible for this incentive would be qualified infectious disease products, and that's as defined by the legislation that was passed last year. So essentially, antibacterial or antifungal drugs intended to treat serious or life-threatening infections. We use the same definition that was included in last year's incentive legislation because it's something that we know our Congress already is familiar with, that these are products that Congress has already essentially said are worthy of federal investment. One very important note about this proposal, we wanted to make sure that that this proposal could be useful to smaller companies who do not yet have a tax burden, because we know that these companies are a really critical source of innovation in this area. So in order to do that, we would allow smaller companies that don't yet have a tax burden to transfer or essentially sell these tax credits to larger pharmaceutical companies who could use them. We had Ernst & Young perform some analysis of the tax credit proposal, largely to help us determine what the cost to the federal government would be of enacting this proposal, because we knew that that information would be very important for any potential champions on Capitol Hill. So we found the overall federal revenue loss would be about $550 million over 10 years. We know that is not a small chunk of money, but we do believe that it is not going to be insurmountable either, particularly if we do our job at demonstrating that essentially the cost of inaction on this issue would be far greater. So according to the Ernst & Young analysis that we had performed, the proposed tax credit would reduce the average expected cost of new antibiotic and antifungal research expenditures by about 23%. Ernst & Young believes this would result in accelerated and new drug developments, with the result of having increased future antibiotic and antifungal drug approvals. The analysis indicated that the credit would stimulate additional spending in phases 2 and 3 for drugs that are already in development, which could hopefully help accelerate the approval of these drugs. We believe that the current financial obstacle of moving successful phase 2 drugs to the more expensive phase 3 would be reduced by this credit. We believe the credit would also stimulate investments in new drugs entering the pipeline, because a 23% reduction in the expected total cost of drug development would help increase the return on investment for these drugs. So ultimately, Ernst & Young indicated in their analysis that this tax credit would result in 5 or 6 new antibiotic or antifungal drugs entering the R&D pipeline each year. So what is the outlook for moving forward on these kinds of initiatives? We've been very lucky to at least be getting a lot of attention to this problem in the U.S. recently. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, issued a report that hopefully many or all of you have seen this September on antibiotic resistance threats. It garnered a lot of attention in our media and as well on Capitol Hill. We hosted a congressional briefing with the head of CDC on this report that was attended by about 100 congressional staff, which I can tell you is a pretty significant turnout for these kinds of events. So there is strong interest on Capitol Hill for addressing this problem. Just a couple of weeks ago, PBS aired a documentary on nightmare bacteria, which I know another one of our speakers was included in that documentary. It was excellent. It's online. I definitely recommend that people check that out if they haven't seen it already. And again, this was another way of really garnering a lot more attention among our policymakers, media, and the public. So IDSA, we view it as being our job to really work to maintain this momentum and help turn it into some action from Congress and from the administration. So we have joined forces with Pew Charitable Trusts, and together we developed some principles that would guide the drafting of LPAD legislation. We released those principles over the summer, and they were signed onto by over 20 medical societies, small pharmaceutical companies, and public health organizations. The President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCAST, recommended in their report last year that FDA create a new special medical use designation for the approval of drugs of subpopulations for patients with unmet medical needs. As they described this special medical use, term, it essentially sounded as though they were describing LPAD. They just used a different name for it. And we certainly believe that antibiotics that would treat multi-drug resistant organisms would fit within their criteria. So we saw another kind of sign of support for this approach through that group of folks. In the House of Representatives, Congressman Gingrey and Congressman Green, who were the same bipartisan duo behind last year's antibiotic incentives legislation, are working on legislation that would enact LPAD, which they hope to introduce next month. And Senators Hatch and Senator Bennett have also indicated interest in working on LPAD legislation. We are at an earlier point in working on the tax credit proposal. We're actually just going to begin approaching members of Congress who could be potential champions for that bill next week when I return back to the States. I will note that the tax committees in Congress contain some different members and some different staff than the folks we typically work with on health issues, so we will have to be doing a lot of education on the problem and the need for government action among those folks. Cost will certainly remain a concern for anyone following federal budget issues. Anything that has a price tag associated with it is a bit challenging to enact. But again, I think it's incumbent upon us to demonstrate that the cost of inaction is actually going to be far greater than the cost of action. So that is what we always try to present with our government folks. So with that, I'll conclude and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.